Hello and welcome to the third installment of our workshop series, Building Blocks, How to Structure Your Story.
Last week we talked about the importance of time and place. We looked at the who, what, when and where of the ordinary world.
Something happened at the inciting incident, there was a refusal of the quest, and then we reached the Act 1 climax, and we crossed the threshold into Act 2, the middle of your story.
Which is what we're going to talk about now. So, in the hero's journey structure, Act 2 opens with fun and games. This has also been called tests, allies and enemies.
This is when your protagonist goes off on their new path, they learn new skills, they meet allies, they're having tests and they're encountering enemies. This is usually the fun part of the story, and the stakes are generally quite low and things are going quite well.
Yeah, so if you're thinking of what to include in here, you can set things up that are going to be paid off later. The momentum and the tension should begin to build, extra subplots can be introduced and some secondary storylines. It's basically when the story really gets going, and it's when you can really have fun as a writer.
So, to bring it back to our favourite film that we were talking about earlier, Back to the Future, the first film, the fun and games is when Marty goes back in time to 1955 and he's encountering tests, he's making allies, and he's also making some enemies in Biff.
Oh, Biff. In Macbeth, Macbeth talks with Banquo. He sees a floating dagger. He hums and ha's until he finally kills the king. He shows up the next morning. He's like, "What? The king's dead? I didn't know." He gets crowned as king himself, Not a lot of fun for Duncan and people like that, but it's fun for the audience. Macbeth's having fun. Things are going well for him. There's tests. He makes allies. Lady Macbeth and the Murderers.
It sounds like a band name.
Yeah, it does. Lady Macbeth and the Murderers. There's also enemies, which is everyone else.
It's also like a band name, the enemies. Yep. So another example would be in translations. The fun and games part is when Owen and Yolland are sort of looking at the maps and they're translating the place names from Irish into English, and it's also where Yolland meets Moira for the first time. So that's where the romantic subplot starts to develop.
Yeah, so it's sort of the start of the meat of your story. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of what fun and games is. But now, as we're going deeper into these videos, we're going to go a wee bit deeper into structure itself.
Yeah, so as we travel into our story, it's also helpful not to just to think in terms of the bigger acts, the 3 acts, but also scenes within those acts. So we're going to break things down a little bit more and look at what a scene is.
Yeah, what do we mean by scene? In a TV or film script, it's very clear. They're labelled. They're maybe 2 to 3 pages long, but a play's different. You might get some plays that do have scenes. Shakespeare plays have scenes, but many modern plays, especially one-act plays, don't have scenes labelled at all. But we would argue that everything has scenes, all plays have scenes.
So what is a scene?
Well, to the flip chart!
To the flip chart! And scene. Okay, thanks for joining us at the flip chart again.
So, scenes. What are scenes? Scenes are smaller units of dramatic action within a larger act, within a larger play. Because stories are fractal in nature.
Fractal. What does that mean?
Fractal means, if you're in mathematics, if there is a shape and you zoom in on the shape, the zoomed in area is the same as the zoomed out area. So at every stage, it is the same shape. So if we think back to our first video, we talked about the structure of stories. Stories are 1, 2, 3. And so every part of a story, a scene, should also be 1, 2, 3.
Introduction, development, conclusion, thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Each scene is like a little microcosm of the full play.
So the beginning, the introduction, this is where the character wants something specific and they usually do something to achieve that goal.
The development, the turning point. Something changes or destabilizes or advances the situation. Your character is forced to make a decision, and something might be learned which changes your character.
And then you have the third part, the conclusion. That's the new reality. That's the fallout from the turning point. Something has changed which leads directly to the next scene.
Your protagonist might be knocked onto a new course or have a new plan to get what they want or solve their problem. And their reactions to how they do this, that's going to reveal things about their character.
So characters are constantly changing in every scene. That makes up the bigger overall change across the play. Whatever happens in the scene is like a stepping stone in their arc across the play.
Every scene should end on a question. Not a literal question in dialogue, but a question the audience might ask themselves, what's going to happen next?
As an actor, you talk about actioning and uniting, and that's breaking down scenes into sort of motivations and things like that. So looking at characters' desires and looking how they use different tactics to change.
Yeah, and that's kind of the essence of a scene. A scene can be thought of as your character using a tactic to try and get something, having that tactic come up against an obstacle and be changed by that, and therefore trying a new tactic which will start the next scene. Your characters shouldn't keep trying to do the same thing. That doesn't develop. They should change.
So if you're writing something and you identify large sections of your writing that your characters aren't changing, you might want to look at that, because the essence of drama is conflict and change.
Yeah. And here's an exercise. You can pause your video and do it now, or do it a bit later, because it's quite involved, but we think it's very useful. I want you to find a single act play, a pressure cooker play. Closed time, closed space, if you remember that from our last video. And we want you to see if you can split it up into different scenes.
What are the smaller units of dramatic action? Look for moments of change in the script. Can you separate the script into scenes within a larger passage of text?
Like, there's no right answer to this. Two people might look at the same script and come up with different ideas, but it's a tool. And it's good whenever you're looking at your own writing, you can split that up and see, okay, this is the section where this character changes and this character changes. It's just a tool.
As well as thinking about scenes as 1, 2, 3, we also like to think of them as tiny plays themselves, almost like tiny act 2s. So you could start on the fun and games. Then you have the midpoint, which is the turning point where something happens. And then things get a bit more complex as the scene goes on. And they finish on the worst point, which is then the inciting incident for your next scene.
So, now you know what a scene is, something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Let's go back to overall structure, because stories are fractal. And we're going to look at the middle of the story, halfway through the midpoint. Let's go back to the chairs. So, halfway through your story, you come to the midpoint. Midpoint has often been called the midterm exam, the point of no return, or the midpoint reversal. This is a crossroads moment for your character where everything changes and they have a reversal of fortunes.
So at the midpoint, our character usually does something, or something happens to them, which means they can no longer just turn back. It's an ordeal or a test that results in knowledge being gained that can never be lost. The sword is pulled from the stone, or the elixir has been retrieved but not yet used.
And in a more personal journey sense, the protagonist enters their inmost cave and realizes their flaw. They are now changed, and or their quest is changed as they move towards the climax of the play.
So an example of this, Hamlet. The midpoint for Hamlet is when he realizes that his uncle Claudius is guilty through the play within a play. So now his quest is changed. He's not just trying to establish the guilt of Claudius, he's actually trying to plan his revenge. But he has to overcome his fatal flaw, his inability to act.
In Back to the Future, our favourite film, Marty realizes exactly at the midpoint that his presence in the past has potentially stopped his parents from getting together, which would mean he would no longer be born. His quest is not, let's get back to 1985. It is now, let's get my parents back together or I will cease to exist.
Mm-hmm. In John B. Keane's The Field, it's exactly at the midpoint is where the auction is held, and William buys the field. And the Bull McCabe threatens William, and basically that's where he starts to formulate a plan to exact revenge on William.
In The Empire Strikes Back, Luke Skywalker is training with Yoda on Dagobah. He enters a cave, a physical cave, but he also enters his own personal inmost cave, where he confronts his flaws. In a vision, he fights Darth Vader. He lops off his head and sees his own head staring back at him, representing his own desire to be drawn to the dark side. Luke's quest is now to save his friends, but also he needs to be worried about not turning to the dark side himself.
Yes, so another one is Titanic, and what happens halfway through Titanic? Yes, so it's when the ship hits the iceberg, and suddenly the characters change their quest of engaging in having relations in steamy cars to a struggle for their very survival.
Essentially, it's something that happens in the very middle that upends everything else. So, moving on from the dirty, steamy car midpoint, we have the next section in the hero's journey. Things get serious, sometimes called the bad guys close in.
This is almost like an inverse fun and games, except things aren't fun anymore. It deals with the fallout from the midpoint, and things are getting worse and worse as there are progressive complications to the quest, and things are just getting more difficult for our protagonist.
The protagonist's quest has changed in the midpoint, but they don't know how to deal with that, and so things are getting worse. They don't know how to deal with the knowledge that they have gained, and jeopardy mounts.
So one example of this would be in Macbeth. Macbeth starts to panic. He goes back to the witches to get more assurances. He ends up killing Macduff's family, and then because of that, Malcolm and Macduff start to rally their troops against him.
In Back to the Future, this is when Marty realizes that he needs to get his parents back together. But he can't do it. He tries everything. He keeps trying to get his parents back together, and it doesn't work. Things keep going wrong in the lead up to the enchantment under the sea dance.
So the Things Get Serious builds to the worst point. This is the all is lost moment for the protagonist. This is when everything that has been going against them comes to a head.
It's the worst point. It does what it says in the tin. It's the lowest point for your character as all the internal and external conflicts get the better of them. The character should believe that things are truly lost and there is no hope for victory.
What's the worst possible thing that could happen to your protagonist? That's what you need to be thinking about at the worst point. This is the lowest point in the story for them. So when you're trying to think of what you should do here, you should think of what's the worst thing that could happen to them, and then do that to them.
Yeah, be mean to your characters, essentially. So examples, in Back to the Future, Marty is unable to get his parents together. He's playing guitar at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, and he starts to disappear. He looks at the photograph, he's not in it anymore, and his hand literally disappears. It looks like he might be erased from existence.
In Hamlet, the worst point is when Hamlet realises his actions have led to Ophelia's death.
In The Importance of Being Earnest, so even in light comedies like that, there's still a worst point. It's when Jack and Algernon's ruse of pretending to be other people is finally uncovered.
Yeah, so for your story to be structurally satisfying, the worst point should be the direct result of the inciting incident of Act 1. So whatever story you were setting up in Act 1, this should be the worst possible consequence of it. The worst thing that could happen for your character.
Yeah, so in the inciting incident Back to the Future, what's the worst thing that could happen if Marty goes back to 1955? The worst thing that could happen is he is erased from existence.
He just never exists whatsoever, and that's what happens when he starts fading away. So it's a pretty bad moment for Marty. So what we'll do now is we'll do another exercise with you, and this is what we want you to do. Think of a character and an inciting incident, something that happens to them or something they do, and then write out 5 possible worst outcomes. And that should give you a good range of possible worst points for your play.
So pause your video, give that a go, and we'll do the same. Good luck.
So, we're back. What did you think of as an inciting incident and 5 possible worst outcomes?
Alright, so I thought, what about a man who wants to marry his girlfriend,
Okay.
but he can't afford the ring. That's his ordinary world. So his inciting incident is he decides to rob a bank.
Okay, so he robs a bank to pay for the ring.
Yeah.
What's the worst possible outcome of this?
He could get life in prison, and so he's never going to be able to marry her because he's going to be in prison.
Yeah, another one.
She could witness him robbing the bank and break up with him. So in the act of trying to get the money, he loses her.
Okay.
Or she could die. There could be like a police shootout, and she comes along to save him, and she gets shot.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah. Or maybe he actually successfully robs the bank, buys a ring, but the ring's cursed, and he puts it on his girlfriend, and she crumbles to ashes.
Or maybe she marries the bank teller.
Yeah, that's good too.
Yeah. Okay, not bad. So you have 5 options there now for your worst point of the story, of a story that began with a bank robbery. So lastly, before we come to the end of Act 2, we have one more moment in a story, and that's called the dark night of the soul.
So after the all is lost moment, your protagonist reacts to this. They experience doubt and reluctance and regression. It's often called a spiritual death.
Point in a film, usually 3/4 of the way through in most films, most Hollywood films for sure, there's a moment where the protagonist is looking out a window and they're really glum, and it's at night time and it's raining and they're really sad and they're thinking about how am I going to move on.
The Dark Night of the Soul is kind of similar to the refusal of the quest in Act 1. And then the climax becomes like the choosal in the Act 1 climax. Because your protagonist must now make a choice. They must change or they will die. They cannot continue unless they face their fears.
So it's at the dark night of the soul moment, which is at the very end of Act 2, before we move into Act 3, that the characters look deep inside themselves and they find a way to overcome the challenges they face. The hero conceives of a winning plan and at the very least is reinvigorated enough to attempt to solve the story's conflict once and for all.
They're no longer hopeless and they're committed to fighting for their cause.
So let's look at examples. Back to the Future. It's actually a very, very short Dark Night of the Soul in Back to the Future. The all is lost moment was he starts to fade away, ceasing to exist. Dark Night of the Soul is he's looking across at his parents and he's hoping that they're going to kiss, but he's wondering what's going to happen as he looks on forlornly.
Marty is actually a very non-active protagonist.
In the first film, he's not as active,
it's not that great,
but he becomes more and more developed through the second and third films.
In Macbeth, it's when Lady Macbeth dies, and Macbeth gives his famous tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech, where he thinks on the pointlessness of life and death. If this was a non-tragic play, it was a happy play, Macbeth would use this to get through his issues and come out in the end changed. However, it's a bit of an inverse here, because it's a tragedy. He doesn't change, he stays the same, and that is what ultimately leads to his own death.
So that's Dark Night of the Soul, which is the end of Act 2. We hope we haven't left you on a downer and that you're having your own Dark Night of the Soul, screaming all is lost and looking out windows going, why the hell did I watch this video? I'm really depressed. Because the next time we're going to go and look at the ending, and in a 3-act structure, usually the third act is a positive. It's a much more positive thing. So
basically watch the next one to get a G up. But before we do, let's recap. To the flip chart!
To the flip chart! There you go. So, Act 2. Let's just do a recap of that.
So, we got fun and games.
Fun and games is the part where you have fun, you introduce subplots, you introduce your characters, tests, allies, and enemies.
Then we have the midpoint.
So the midpoint's in the middle of your play. It's usually an ordeal or a test, and it's where the character learns something, but they don't know how to use that piece of knowledge yet.
Complete reversal of fortune. Then we have things get serious.
Things get serious is when there are progressive complications, your character's trying to do something and things just get more and more complicated as they can't achieve that goal.
And things get worse and worse for them until they hit the worst point.
The worst point is exactly what it says in the tin. It's the lowest point for your character, and it's usually related back to the inciting incident of Act 1. This is the worst possible outcome of what was set up in Act 1.
And as your character reacts to the worst point, they experience the dark night of the soul.
This is the boo-hoo moment that we were talking about before. This is when the character thinks about what they're going to do to change their fortune. They look deep within themselves and they think about what they need to do to move into Act 3.
So there we go. That is our Act 2. Act 2 is normally slightly longer than the other 3 acts. If we look at a 3-act structure, normally your Act 2 is just slightly longer than Acts 1 and Act 3.
Sometimes it's half the length of the play or the story itself. Act 1 is a quarter, Act 2 is 2 quarters, and Act 3 a third. But also a lot of the times Act 1 and Act 3 are really short and Act 2 is the longest.
Very long, yeah. So it's just, the acts don't have to be symmetrical, 3 by symmetrical. They are different lengths. But we're going to move into Act 3 next time, where we're going to look at the climax. We're going to look at breaking the climax down even further into a 5-point plan. And then finally, the denouement. And then we're going to wrap things up with a sort of wrap-up, I suppose.
Exactly. So how to end your story, that's what we're going to deal with next. And that will be the end of our video series, so make sure you come back for that.
Thanks very much for watching. Cheers.